Hi there, everyone. My name is John Tigg, and I am the Managing Director for the EMEA region at Cadent. So I just wanted to take sort of 15 to 20 minutes of your time to discuss the growing opportunity of addressable TV. Now, before we get into the detail, the first thing that I wanted to do was just kind of agree some definitions, because one of the things that we've seen a lot in this automated television space is kind of very confusing terminology that really hasn't helped the industry move forward. So look, just a few things I wanted to cover. So the first thing is advanced TV. What is advanced TV? You know, we see it as television that's paired with technology to allow for new features, components, or uses. Now, there are various advertising use cases like addressable TV, like programmatic TV, et cetera, but also other use cases for advanced TV not related to advertising, you know, like interactive TV, where you might see, you know, live sports statistics or live odds or something like that. That all uses advanced television technology. The second one I wanted to cover was addressable TV. So, you know, we see these as targeted TV ads, which are targeted at a household level and typically delivered by a system enabled by a cable operator or a satellite operator, or at least, you know, some kind of telco box. So that could also, for example, include, you know, IPTV telco boxes. It covers both linear and video on demand use cases, but excludes kind of connected TV and smart TV over the top from that definition. The third area is connected TV. Now, you know, connected TV doesn't describe an advertising format or an advertising technology. It simply describes a television that is connected to the internet through either embedded technology, which is in the device itself, or, you know, by something that's connected to it. So that could be, you know, for example, a games console, or some other form of over-the-top set-top box like an Apple TV or a Chromecast or a Roku. And then finally, you know, something that we've become more and more familiar with, you know, programmatic. So obviously that's the automation of the buying and selling of advertising inventory using software. And it's typically done through APIs. So, you know, really describes the process rather than a product itself. But I just think it's really important that we're clear on those terms before we get into any kind of discussion around addressable TV itself. So moving on, wanted to start by just looking at the addressable market at a very kind of macro level before we start to think about what's going on in Europe. So what do we see here? So look, we're looking at a slide really showing the growth in TV and online video ad spend from all the way back in 2010 and looking forward to 2023. And just really a couple of things to note here. So according to Strategy Analytics, you know, we are projecting a market opportunity in both television and online video of about $250 billion by 2023. Now, most experts are predicting that about a third of all budget that is television and digital video will leverage some form of data and automation in the next 3 years. And that itself represents about an $80 billion opportunity when you look at the worldwide market as a whole. Now, you know, the big question here is that going to be, you know, that $80 billion going to be incremental to the TV ecosystem, or is it going to cannibalize some of that traditional spend and online video spend that already exists? And that's something that we're going to get into some detail on a little bit later. But the truth is it probably will to some extent, but we expect it to kind of grow the overall size of the pie at the same time. So kind of getting into some of the markets that are more mature, at least in the addressable TV sense. Really, we have no choice but to look at the US addressable market as an example of where we think the European market might go in a couple of different ways. So look, the first thing to point out here is that the market has seen sustained and strong growth since kind of its emergence back in 2016. And, you know, we're expecting to see growth of about 30% from 19 to 20. So, a classic adoption curve that you see in innovation. One of the kind of really encouraging things we're seeing is obviously there's been a large growth in ad spending, and also that there is a desire amongst large traditional advertisers to get into this addressable space, and they see it as something that they'll be either using or experimenting with in the coming year. And the other thing to point out here is that what we see in the US market is a growth factor of about 3 to 5 times traditional TV CPM. Now, in markets in Europe where addressable TV already exists, like in the UK, anecdotally at least, we've heard that we've heard bigger growth factors against traditional TV CPMs. We can expect that to come down, but at least by looking at this, we can see a little bit of where the television market is likely to go. And if indeed we do see 3 to 5 times traditional TV CPMs, then that represents a real opportunity for both broadcasters and television platform operators as this market grows. And again, it's estimated in the US that about 30% of the $70 billion TV market will use addressable capabilities in the next 3 to 5 years. So as we kind of take those learnings and start to look at the European addressable market, that clearly there are some peculiarities about the European market, which we need to appreciate when thinking about how much of that can translate to the market in Europe. So the first thing to point out, the first difference to point out with the US market is there is no inventory split between operators and broadcasters over here. So, just very briefly, in the United States, cable operators typically get 2 minutes per hour of advertising inventory to sell across the channels that they carry. Now, that just doesn't exist in the European market. And obviously, the upshot of that is that from the get-go, there's going to be a lot less liquidity of supply available without a broadcaster and an operator working together to enable that from a technology point of view, but also from an advertising inventory point of view. So a really big difference that mustn't be underestimated. The second thing is, and as a kind of result of that, this requires commercial agreements to exist between broadcasters and platform operators, and that might seem like an obvious thing to say, but it's proved to be a huge stumbling block for broadcasters and operators in the European market as they try to figure out, what the value is of addressable advertising, and therefore how revenue should be shared across those two parties. But that is really a requirement for this market to grow. The third thing, just to point out here, is that broadcasters in Europe really tightly control almost all of the content distribution and ad sales rights around kind of long-form premium professionally produced content. And so what we haven't seen, like we've seen in the US, we haven't seen kind of the growth of independent AVOD platforms that have been able to scale an advertising business simply because they haven't had the right to sell advertising against that broadcast content. And that's kind of slowed the market down to some extent, but it's just something that we need to be aware of. And finally, of course, when we talk about the European market, we're talking about a multi-market ecosystem. And therefore, it has several different problems, whether they happen to be about regulations in different markets, different commercial rules. And obviously, the infrastructure in different markets, from a platform operator perspective in particular, is going to be different. And so you can't just translate what we've learned in one sort of single market to a market with kind of a multitude of different factors at play, like we see here in Europe. So something just to appreciate that. But as we kind of look into the detail of the European market, we see kind of 2 or 3 trends that point towards growth in this area. So the first one of those, very obviously, European broadcasters are widely monetizing, OTT and IP-based VOD, have been doing so for some time very successfully. The natural progression there is obviously then to start thinking about linear advertising and bringing data and automation to that space. The digital video ad market is still growing very quickly, about 30% year over year when you take into account all the major markets in Europe, according to the IAB. And one thing in particular that I think is encouraging is that agencies are starting to drive the market by increasing demand for addressable advertising. We've seen the growth of businesses like Finecast, an addressable TV advertising agency based out of the UK. But one of the things that's a real challenge for buyers is that liquidity of supply is generally low across all markets, and so perhaps a slightly chicken and egg situation. However, we need to look at kind of what is catalyzing this change towards addressability. The first and inescapable thing is the continuing decline of traditional linear ad ratings. This is pushing broadcasters to look at how they can increase their yield from a shrinking pool of inventory in linear, which advertisers still really want because it provides such a powerful response for audiences. And obviously, there's a lot more competition for viewing minutes. There's only so much TV that someone can watch in a day, from entrants like Netflix and Amazon and other over-the-top platforms that typically don't carry advertising. So that's kind of creating an anxiety to change amongst some of the bigger players in the European broadcast ecosystem. So what are we seeing? Well, the first thing to point out is that in spite of those challenges that we point out, Sky has built a formidable business in addressable television advertising, anecdotally attracting about 100 million in ad spend back in 2018 and growing at a fair clip, and really proving that some of those challenges around measurement and so forth that are talked about so much are not insurmountable. And that there is, a real desire in the market for more addressable technology. The second thing is that, we are seeing broadcasters and platform operators across Europe actively seek tech partners to enable addressability. We're going to go into that in some detail, but that's obviously very encouraging. And, according to a number of sources, by 2022, we expect to see about a third of advanced advertising in Europe become addressable. So reflecting quite nicely the statistic that we saw earlier from US advertisers. And when we look at kind of this chart, which is from Barb itself, you start to see where that will come from. So again, just matching the earlier trend we were looking at, going from 2016 forward, in this case 2022. It's the growth of addressable linear, addressable time-shifted TV, and addressable online video, and that we'd expect to see about 30% of all ad minutes that are viewed by consumers being delivered using data and automation in an addressable manner, by 2022. So quite a nice marriage between the statistics we saw earlier for the US and those for Europe. Now, I think it's worth spending some time just looking at how television is being viewed in Europe. Now, when you look at this, the immediate thing that jumps out to you is that, people are still watching the majority of their television in a linear fashion. Yes, in some markets, notably the UK, there are other formats, time-shifted TV in particular, and pay TV, VOD, have grown dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years. But as a whole, linear is still what is driving viewership across the major markets in Europe. And so when you think about addressable advertising, you cannot think about it in these different silos. Addressable advertising needs to work seamlessly across a live environment, across a VOD environment, and also platforms when you may not be at home. So, notably, obviously, those who want to watch TV or live on their mobile devices is a huge growth area also. And so, for any platform operator that is looking at this area, just enabling one of those things is not enough. You need a solution that can enable all of these things to really start to drive some scale towards this market. Now, I mentioned earlier that European markets are at very much different stages of their development in addressable advertising, down to infrastructure, commercial readiness, and regulation. And what I've tried to do here is just sort of plot those things on a chart to try and show where the different markets are. So just looking very briefly at this, on the top right, you've got the UK and Ireland. So both of the major platform operators, Virgin Media and Sky in the UK, are both live with addressable advertising solutions across both live and VOD and time-shifted TV. And so that's kind of put them quite far ahead of other European markets in terms of their development, with the exception of probably Belgium and to some extent the Netherlands, where we've seen quite a lot of innovation in this area already, with solutions that are also live, but perhaps in a slightly smaller market. So that's why it's represented in a slightly smaller bubble. To just touch on a couple of the other markets, obviously we see a huge opportunity in France. I think about 55% of all households in France have some kind of connected IPTV box, which kind of represents a huge opportunity for addressability. Having said that, from a legislative point of view, the change hasn't occurred yet that will make addressable advertising legal in that market. We think that that's happening very shortly, but it's not clear yet exactly what will be allowed and what won't be allowed. And then you look at a market like Germany, where there are infrastructure constraints. So typically in the German market, you've seen a large distribution of different set-top box technologies across platform operators, for example, which has made it much more difficult to develop a unified solution for that market. And so that's just a demonstration of some of the different obstacles that the European markets need to overcome to achieve addressability. So just to kind of move along, what we've done here is, when you look at the markets that have enabled addressable, it's really only the UK and Belgium in Europe. Now, what's encouraging is that all of the other major markets are at the moment either in deployment phase or in the testing phase or in the proof of concept phase with addressable tech, but they're not quite there yet. So, it's exciting to see that there's such a huge opportunity yet to be developed in Europe. So, how can addressable TV benefit the whole ecosystem? And this part is really important. And really the first thing to do is, there needs to be a commercial opportunity for all of the players in the market, and especially in continental Europe, where you have platform operators that are not typically content owners, and so therefore don't sell advertising in their own right. There's a need to understand what the business case is for deploying the technology for addressable advertising that ultimately broadcasters will be able to use to sell advertising against. And I think, there's a couple of interesting examples from the US market that are useful here. Now, I've kind of highlighted Roku and Hulu. Now, obviously, these are platform operators. They're virtual platform operators, so they don't have kind of cable technology. They're entirely cloud-based, but they kind of provide a useful example, because obviously they are platforms for distribution, albeit over IP, and they are selling targeted ads and doing dynamic linear ad replacement today, and they're doing very well out of that. And if you kind of look into the detail of those things, you can translate that into metrics that platform operators can understand versus their other businesses. So, things like, what does that mean from an average revenue per user basis or average revenue per household basis as a platform operator? So I think, these examples can be useful for want of kind of better, more local examples. This is a good way of thinking about how you may be able to make money from addressable advertising as a platform operator. One of the things that we can obviously look at is how addressable advertising has already been enabled in the European market, and how, what the role that collaboration plays in doing that. And one of those areas is obviously, collaboration between Sky and Virgin Media in the UK that has seen them create an addressable footprint of more than 10 million households that created real scale and real liquidity. And it's been great to see that, the first third-party broadcaster, Channel 4, has joined the program to really start to bring some scale to addressability in the UK and prove that, with the deployment of the right technology, there is a benefit to the entire ecosystem for deploying the technology for addressable advertising. That's done, mostly via APIs, via data matching across their various respective subscriber bases, and obviously doing that, making sure that they are entirely privacy compliant with GDPR. So how can the opportunity of addressable TV be realized by the European TV business? Well, look, the first thing is measurement. We hear this constantly from across the market as being an obstacle, and that there's no doubt that this needs to be resolved, so that we can understand viewership with one set of data across both, traditional linear viewing and viewing that's occurring through other platforms. This is going to be a hard problem to solve, though, and especially across multiple markets. But I think what's encouraging is that, again, Sky have built a very, very large and very being completely solved. It's the obstacle to this business growing here in Europe. The second thing is that clearly commercial arrangements need to be struck between platform operators and broadcasters. This has probably been the single biggest reason why it's taken a long time for addressable to take off, and something that clearly needs to be resolved in order for it to do so in the coming 2 to 3 years. We were, clearly continued demand growth from advertisers and agencies. We've seen, enormous growth over the last 12 to 24 months. We expect to see that to continue over the coming months and years. And that'll be a big factor in driving the industry forward. And obviously, the final thing is the development of some technical standards for ATV execution, in particular, ensuring that, that the market is building to the same set of standards so that those can be adopted more widely. That's what's really going to drive scale through these platforms and to really create the market that we all want. So what's it going to take? Well, collaboration, basically. And, really the first thing it will do is drive new revenue from platform assets. So for TV platform operators, an entirely incremental opportunity to drive revenue from their base of subscribers and from the data they have on those subscribers in an entirely privacy compliant way. The second thing is obviously to improve the consumer experience. Sky have talked at length about the improvements they see in things like channel hopping during ad breaks when they're showing. I think it's about a 50% difference when you show addressable versus a traditional linear break. So it's a really encouraging thing there. Obviously not forgetting the viewer that's actually watching the content. And the third thing, of course, to support content partners, broadcasters' revenue models. So, as their businesses develop and as viewing habits start to change, deploying technology that's going to allow for an increase in yield from linear and VOD assets. So that's everything. I hope that's covered everything that you wanted to know. And yeah, thank you very much for your time.